Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for coming to this UNE Business School seminar. I want to start acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land that we call New England and show respect to the elders past, present, and emerging of these nations. And I want to thank everyone who is coming to support Mathew. As you know, Mathew is our lecturer in economics here at the UNE Business School. He completed his PhD at the Federation University of Australia, and his thesis received an award for the best dissertation of the history of economic thought society of Australia, and in 2025 he received the Terenzio Machiavelli Prize for best PhD dissertation from the Italian Association, and I know you're going to Europe too very soon, so he's going to share what it's going to present there and continue with the research. So thank you very much for sharing that, Mathew. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emilio. So as Emilio mentioned, I will be traveling over to Europe to present at the joint conference of the History of Economic Society and the European Society for the History of Economic Thought. So this is more just to, I guess, a practice run for this paper. So today I'm presenting on my paper, The Theory of Tariff Incidence, Alexander Hamilton and his 19th century protectionist followers. And what I want to do today is discuss a neglected theory of tariff incidence, which was mainstream among American protectionist circles from the times of Alexander Hamilton through to the late 19th century. And I think it's both significant for the literature on Hamilton, but also significant for the history of American economic thought more generally. And it's significant because it shows that Hamilton developed what appears to be a novel theory of tax incidence, and one which was distinctively non-Smithian in nature. And as we'll see, this is important in the context of the secondary literature. And it's also important for our broader understanding of American economic thought, because it shows that the American protectionist, which was really the distinctive American approach to political economy, developed Hamilton's theory into an analysis of tariff incidence, which shows that where they argued that incidence would actually shift between consumers and producers depending upon the level of industrial development. And I'm making the claim that this is both a distinct and original contribution, but also a quite significant, a quite sophisticated contribution as well. And the theory is not only important for understanding tariff incidence, it's also important because it actually deepens the underlying logic of the infant industry argument for protective tariffs, which is what these economists were arguing for. So the theory has important implications for the question of who bears the cost of a tariff, or what is known as the incidence of a tariff. And this is a question that has re-emerged as an area of concern more recently. It's not simply a historical curiosity, but it's important and it relates to the contemporary period. However, it is far from a new concern. It dates back to the founding of classical economics. Now, the conventional answer from Adam Smith comes from Adam Smith. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith states that the duties of customs fall with considerable overcharge upon the consumer. In other words, it's the consumer that pays the cost of a tariff. And this view became orthodoxy in classical political economy, and it still circulates within modern commentary on tariff policy today. Now, the American protectionist school, which originated with Alexander Hamilton, rejected this view, and in its place they established an alternate theory of tariff incidence. Now, the theory itself begins with Alexander Hamilton, but it was developed further over the course of the 19th century by a series of Hamilton's followers, most notably Daniel Raymond, Ellis H. Buren Denslow, and Henry M. Hoyt. So these writers articulated what I'm labeling as a competition theory of tax incidence, And over the course of the 19th century, they transformed it into a dynamic analysis of how tariff incidence shifts as industries develop. So this matters for two reasons. First, it challenges how we understand Alexander Hamilton. So the standard interpretation of Hamilton's economic views, going back to scholars such as Charles Franklin Dunbar, but reiterated by many other secondary sources, is that Hamilton was essentially derivative of Adam Smith. He may well have differed on policy, but he got there by supposedly adapting Smithian economics to alternate conclusions. Now, I guess I'm somewhat of a thorn in the side of those who hold this position. In a recent article that was actually accepted, I showed that Hamilton held to a fundamentally different conception of the individual to Smith. And my forthcoming book also shows that Hamilton's broader school of American protectionists was also a distinct school of thought that challenged classical economics. But even on this question of tariff incidence, Hamilton and his later followers were at odds with Smith and the classical school. And even though Hamilton doesn't mention Smith by name when he's developing this theory of tariff incidence, it seems as if he is actually directly challenging Smith, even though it's not explicit. And this theoretical divergence leads to profound implications when it comes to understanding who bears the incidence of a tariff. Okay, so I'll give a brief introduction to the figures involved and how they fit into the story. So we'll focus primarily on 5 key figures. You of course have Alexander Hamilton, who was the first US Secretary of the Treasury, and he authored the Report on Manufactures in 1791, where his protectionist views feature most prominently. However, as we'll see, his theory of tariff incidence wouldn't actually feature in the Report on Manufactures. It would actually be in 2 earlier texts. Now, as part of the second generation of this school of thought, we had the Baltimorean economist, Daniel Raymond. He was also the first American economist to write a systematic treatise on political economy, and he was an ardent Hamiltonian. So his chief work was Thoughts on Political Economy, which was published in 1820, and it also went through various other editions and name changes as well. Then it would be in the late 19th century that the last generation of American protectionists would transform Hamilton's theory into its most developed and systematized version. And this would come with the writings of Buren Denslow, Ellis H. and Henry M. Hoyt. So Buren Denslow can be considered as one of the thought leaders of this last generation of American protectionists. He was professor of economics at the Old University of Chicago. He wrote a massive treatise called Principles of Economic Philosophy. And I believe it was last year sometime that I actually presented a paper in this series where I discussed Denslow's theory of his migratory theory of profits. Now, Ellis H. Roberts was another prominent member of the school. He was actually the United States Treasurer under President William McKinley. And he also wrote a massive treatise entitled Government Revenue and Especially the American System. And what is interesting about this work is that he approaches the issue of protectionism from the standpoint of taxation, hence why he discusses tax incidence in that work. And finally, we have Henry M. Hoyt. He was a governor of Pennsylvania, and his primary work was protection versus free trade. And he would actually serve as secretary of the American Protective Tariff League. Now, the last 3 of these economists are incredibly neglected in the secondary literature. Other than my paper on Denslow, there's only one other article which has been devoted to Denslow. And the other 2 figures, Ellis H. Roberts and Henry M. Hoyt, as far as I can tell, there's not a single secondary source on these figures, which seems crazy to me, especially when you consider that Roberts was a United States Treasurer. It's perplexing why there isn't anything written on him. Now finally, it was with this last generation that Hamilton's theory was developed into what I'm calling the incidence shifting mechanism of the protective tariff, which I guess represents the logical endpoint of Hamilton's initial theory. But let's start with Hamilton. So Hamilton's theory of tariff incidence is articulated in two texts, both from 1782, neither of which is a report on manufactures. It was in two earlier texts before the report on manufactures that Hamilton develops this theory. So the first is the Continentalist number 5, which appeared in the New York Packet on April 18, 1782. And the second was the report on the impost, which Hamilton delivered to the Congress of the Confederation in December of the same year. Now, the Continentalist is actually important for a separate reason. It's actually here, not the report on manufactures, where Hamilton first articulates the infant industry argument. So that's something that I came across when conducting other research on this paper. But for the purpose of this paper, what makes these texts interesting is that they contain a theoretical analysis of tariff incidence that doesn't appear anywhere in Adam Smith or in David Hume for that matter. In fact, it seems that Hamilton is actually making a jab at Smith when you actually read these primary sources. Okay, so here is the key passage from Continentalist number 5. So Hamilton writes that the maxim that the consumer pays the duty has been admitted in theory with too little reserve, frequently contradicted in practice. It is true that the merchant will be unwilling to let the duty be a deduction from his profits if the state of the market will permit him to incorporate it with the price of his commodity. But this is often not practicable. It turns upon the quantity of goods at the market in proportion to the demand. When the latter exceeds the former and the competition is among buyers, the merchant can easily increase his price and make the consumer pay the duty. When the reverse is the case, the competition is among sellers. He must then content himself with smaller profits and lose the value of the duty, or at least part of it. So according to Hamilton, the answer of who pays the duty depends on the competitive structure of the market. When demand is intense relative to supply, when buyers are competing with each other for the purchase of goods, then the seller can pass the duty forward onto the consumer. When supply is intense relative to demand, or when different sellers are competing with one another for buyers, then the seller is forced to absorb the duty, or at least part of it, in order to avoid losing sales. So I want to draw attention to what Hamilton's doing here. He's not just disagreeing with Smith on whether the consumer pays the duty, he's offering a theoretical alternative to Smith. And it also seems that he's responding directly to Smith when he says the maxim that the consumer pays the duty has been admitted in theory with too little reserve. So The Wealth of Nations was a popular work in the United States at the time, and when you go to Smith's chapters on taxation, Smith asserts in numerous places that it's the consumer that pays the cost of a duty. And the mechanism is according to Smith, when it comes to the incidence of a duty, is that the merchant would simply pass that on to the consumer. So that's the mechanism according to Smith. There's nothing equivalent to what Hamilton is arguing here that can be found in Smith. So Hamilton's not adapting Smith here, he's presenting a theoretical alternative to Smith. So Hamilton's theory is what I'm calling a competition theory of tariff incidence, or tax incidence in this case. The competitive state of the market is the chief factor which determines who bears the incidence of the tariff. And this is genuinely different to Smith's theory that the consumer pays for duty. Now, there is a slight complication to this story. So Hamilton's second text, the report on the impost, applies the same theoretical framework, but reaches a slightly different conclusion. So in the report on the impost, the competition analysis that was present in his early Continentalist paper is fully present, but Hamilton argues that in the general course of trade, demand for consumption preponderates, and so the incidence will tend to fall on consumers. So this looks like a retreat somewhat from the Continentalist papers. With that said, this deviation is almost certainly political in nature. So the report on the impost was written precisely to convince the commercial state of Rhode Island to support a 5% duty on imports. Rhode Island had objected to such a duty, arguing that it would fall disproportionately on commercial states. And because of this, Hamilton needed to show that the duty would in fact be borne by consumers across the country, rather than by the merchants of Rhode Island in particular. So he emphasises in the market that competition among consumers for the purchase of commodities dominates, which allows merchants to shift the incidence onto consumers. But it's very clearly the case that he's doing it for matters of political expediency here. And the reason why I don't think this undermines, but actually strengthens the case that Hamilton devised a theoretical alternative to Smith, is that it would have been much easier for Hamilton to simply invoke Smith's maxim in order to make the case in his report. Again, Smith's Wealth of Nations was a very popular work at the time. Smith was an established authority on the topic. And Smith's theory is also less complicated than Hamilton's. But Hamilton still continues to employ his competition theory of tax incidence, even though he arrives at the alternate conclusion that consumers pay for the duty. So despite arriving in this instance that the consumer pays a disproportionate amount of the duty, Hamilton's underlying theory of tariff incidence remains intact in the report on the impost. Now, Hamilton's theory might have remained a curiosity if it was only confined to those two 1782 texts. But what adds to the significance is that it was picked up and developed by a succession of 19th century American writers, and particularly those of the American Protectionist school. Now, as far as I can tell, the first writer to have picked up Hamilton's theory was Daniel Raymond. This shouldn't really come as a surprise, since Raymond was a committed Hamiltonian, and he was also the first American economist to produce a systematic treatise on political economy. However, it was actually in his 1828 pamphlet entitled The American System that Raymond extends Hamilton's framework in an important way, and this is the observation that when it comes to when a protective tariff restricts imports, it stimulates production, so the operation of the tariff itself has a second order effect on the incidence of a tariff. In other words, as domestic production expands through the imposition of a tariff, the competitive structure of the market itself changes, which means that the incidence of the tariff also changes as well. So here is how Raymond puts it. The incidence of an impost for the consumer will be reduced in proportion as the domestic production of an article increases. The tendency of a tariff to keep the market at its present price by excluding a portion of foreign article until the domestic supply comes up to the demand. And when it comes up to be the case, then prices commence to fall again, so thereby shifting the incidence away from consumers. Now, the quote doesn't quite do justice to what Raymond is saying. Following Hamilton, Raymond's full text talks about competition between consumers and producers conditioning the incidence of the tariff. And there's even more of a behavioural analysis in Raymond's text. So he talks about how producers, they might have anxiety about whether or not they can sell their commodities given the state of competition in the market. So this actually causes them to absorb more of the tariff incidence. So there's even a behavioural analysis here. And the other thing is that Raymond's pamphlet is explicitly arguing against a report that was written by the Boston free trader Henry Lee. And Henry Lee's report was actually invoking Adam Smith's maxim that the consumer pays for the tariff. So here you see Raymond actually restarting this debate again that Hamilton had originally commenced with Smith, but in a different context. In any event, the crucial development made by Raymond is that he's making the case that a tariff doesn't just have a static effect on the incidence of the tariff, it has a dynamic effect because the tariff itself reshapes the competitive structure of the market over time. As domestic supply expands, foreign producers facing increasing competition from domestic producers, they are then forced to absorb more of the tariff in order to remain in the market. So Raymond is taking Hamilton's static theory of competition and incidence and developing it more towards a dynamic theory of how incidence is affected by industrial development itself. Now, admittedly, Raymond's treatment is not the most systematic and not the most refined, but he's still pushing Hamilton's theory in this direction. Now, the full development of this theory really comes in the 1880s with three writers, these being Buren Denslow, Ellis H. Roberts, and Henry M. Hoyt. And what Denslow, Roberts, and Hoyt did is they systematized Hamilton and Raymond's observation into what I've coined as the protective tariff incidence shifting mechanism. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but that's what I've labeled it at this point in time. And this incidence mechanism basically goes like this. So when a tariff is first imposed on a foreign good that competes with an infant domestic industry, this creates an artificial scarcity in the market because the tariff limits imports, and domestic industries aren't yet developed enough to supply the full domestic demand, with imports remaining dominant. In this case, the competition for the purchase of commodities among consumers exceeds the competition from producers to sell commodities. So by Hamilton's logic, the incidence of the tariff falls primarily on domestic consumers. Now, an important dimension of this is that the tariff is most protective at exactly this point in time, because foreign producers are shifting the incidence onto domestic consumers due to the scarcity in the market. So purchasing imports at this point in time is the most costly time for consumers to actually be buying imports. Now, since the tariff is most protective at this point in time, so when it's initially imposed, it means that the production of domestic substitutes is also the most profitable at this point in time. Foreign producers are shifting the incidence onto domestic consumers by charging a higher price. This means higher prices in the domestic market and therefore higher profits to be reaped by domestic producers. So this encourages domestic infant industries to expand, and with it expanding domestic production. And as domestic production expands, the competitive structure of the market shifts. Domestic supply increases, eventually approaching domestic demand and eliminating the scarcity originally imposed by the tariff. And as that happens, foreign producers are forced to absorb a growing share of the tariff incidence in order to remain competitive with domestic producers. And of course, those domestic producers aren't subject to the tariff. Tariffs are only imposed on imports, so the foreign producers are on the back foot competitively, and that's why they need to absorb the tariff in order to remain competitive when facing competition from domestic production. So here's how Denslow puts it in 1883. In the case of every really protective duty, therefore, there is a domestic production which the duty is constantly stimulating into a condition nearly approximating that of a fully supplying the demand. When the American supply is wholly or nearly adequate to the American demand, it may nevertheless happen that an article will be imported, notwithstanding that the American price is no higher than the foreign. In every such case, the foreigner either divides the duty with the consumer or pays it all. When our customs revenues are in a manner paid by foreigners, they are not a tax on the American consumer at all. So you can see the full reversal here. At the start, the consumer bears the tariff incidence. At maturity, the foreign producer bears the tariff. And the mechanism that drives this shift is the operation of the tariff itself, which stimulates domestic production, which eventually displaces foreign production. Likewise, you have Roberts writing in 1884, who articulates the general principle even more explicitly. The law of incidence may be clearly stated. The tendency is first to charge every impost to the final consumer of the commodity affected, but against this tendency acts an increase of supply relative to demand. The incidence will depend upon the ease and rapidity in which the supply can be increased relative to the demand. The operation of the impost magnifies the profits in that branch of trade so affected, and when those profits are carried above average, competition enters and leads soon to an augmentation of supply that the consumer gets the benefit. In other words, the consumer gets the benefit via the foreign producer actually absorbing the incidence once domestic competition is stimulated. Likewise, you also have Hoyt in 1886. The duty on the products of competing industries abroad operates partly for revenue, partly as protection. Whenever the American production in such industries reaches the American demand, the price ceases in any manner to be affected by the protective duty. In the latter case, if the article is imported, the foreign producer pays the whole duty or at best divides it with the home consumer, and the tax goes into the national treasury. Now, in my view, this is a genuinely impressive piece of analytical work, especially for its time. What Denslow, Roberts, and Hoyt are all articulating is what amounts to an incidence shifting mechanism, whereby the incidence of a tariff shifts between foreign producers and domestic consumers, depending upon the level of industrial development. During the infant industry phase, incidence is absorbed by the consumers, but this also makes the tariff more effective when infant industries need protection the most. However, as industries develop, foreign producers absorb the incidence due to pressure from domestic competitors, which means that the cost of the tariff for the consumer will increasingly diminish over time, and also at the time when protection is required the least. Okay, so I want to draw out a few implications of this incidence shifting mechanism. First, to reiterate, the mechanism implies that protective tariffs are most protective when industries need protection the most, when they're truly infant industries. So there's a kind of self-regulating logic to the infant industry argument. The tariff is doing its protective work most effectively precisely when the industry is least able to compete on its own. Second, the mechanism implies that the cost of the tariff to domestic consumers diminishes over time as the industry matures and incidence is shifted onto foreign producers. This addresses one of the standard objections to protectionism, which is that it imposes a permanent tax on consumers. So the American protectionist tradition here, they're saying, no, the tax isn't permanent, it's transitional, at least it's transitional for consumers, and it falls increasingly on foreign producers as the protected industry develops. So in the long run, it isn't really a tax on consumers, and it fits with the broader logic of the infant industry argument. So the logic of the infant industry argument is that it makes sense to incur a short-term cost for long-run development, and according to this mechanism, this logic is actually embedded into the operation of the tariff itself, because the cost to the consumer will actually diminish over time. Now third, it also challenges the secondary literature's cheap treatment of the American protectionists, namely that they were basically adapting Smithian and classical economics. This mechanism represents a genuine theoretical alternative to the Smithian position and classical economics more generally. The Smithian view that the consumer simply pays the tariff was rejected by the American protectionists, and they came up with an alternative, which is it's based on the level of competition in the market and the level of industrial development. Now, just a brief note before I close, and I'll just make a note on the subject of revenue-only tariffs. So the American protectionists recognize that the incidence shifting mechanism only operates when a protective tariff is applied. It doesn't operate for what's known as revenue-only tariffs. By the way, what's meant by revenue-only tariffs is these are tariffs on goods that cannot be produced domestically and are only imposed for the explicit objective for raising revenue. In other words, they're tariffs that are imposed on non-competing imports. So for the likes of the United States, this could be the likes of coffee beans or other crops that are unsuited to the American climate, right? So many American protectionists took this to imply that revenue-only tariffs would actually fall exclusively on consumers, hence why they argued that protective tariffs were actually inherently superior than a revenue-only tariff. However, I also want to circle back to Daniel Raymond because he takes a more nuanced position on this matter. So Raymond argued that consumers can economize on consumption or shift to functional substitutes when a revenue-only tariff is applied. And this actually also has the effect of forcing foreign producers to bear at least some of the burden of the tariff, even when it's levied on non-competing imports. So to quote Raymond, "It is not, however, true that the consumer pays the whole duty, even upon those articles which are wholly foreign production. The nation has been in the habit of paying millions of dollars a year for coffee, and the people cannot, without greatly subtracting from their ordinary expenditures, pay an additional sum. They'll therefore use coffee with more economy or substitute for other articles for it, and in this way diminish their consumption. The foreign producers are anxious to sell, and the consequences therefore will be that they must reduce the price, and the incidence must be equally shared by producers and consumers." Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this is what Raymond's actually alluding to is the role of elasticity when it comes to tax incidence, which actually anticipates the neoclassical theory of tax incidence. If consumers can economize or switch to substitutes, it means that there's a degree of elasticity there when it comes to their demand, meaning that the foreign producer will actually absorb some of the incidence even with a revenue-only tariff. And I should note that this came in the 1820s, which was well in advance of the neoclassical theory of tax incidence. Now, I should stress that this elasticity side of things wasn't the primary factor that these guys looked at. They emphasized the competitive state of the market as being the primary factor that determines who bears the incidence, but there was at least still some acknowledgement there that elasticity also had a role to play. Okay, so just to wrap up, what I've tried to show is that there was a distinctive approach in American economic thought, beginning with Hamilton in 1782 and developed through the 19th century that offers a genuinely sophisticated theory of tariff incidence. It is grounded in an analysis of competitive forces. It is dynamic rather than static, at least in its final and most refined version. It also identifies a mechanism which I've labelled the incidence shifting mechanism, by which the burden of a tariff shifts from domestic consumers to foreign producers as the protected industry matures, which reinforces the underlying logic of the infant industry argument, while also rejecting the claim that the incidence of the tariff falls exclusively on consumers. Now, this theory of tax incidence has been completely overlooked in the secondary literature. Now, whether or not one accepts the policy conclusions from this, I think their analysis itself deserves recognition. Now, speaking of recognising neglected traditions, my book comes out in August, and if you want to learn more about these guys, you can order a copy here. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mathew. Very, very interesting. We will order very soon your book.
Or request the UNE library to do so. You know, if we all just bombard them, they'll be forced to buy it. So.
I hope it will be on the corridor display area.
I'll get some complimentary copies. I'll provide one. Yeah.
Okay. So, any question or comment that you might have for those online or here? To see you.
I probably don't need the microphone.
Yeah, but otherwise, I'm not
okay.
sure they're gonna hear you. So, yeah. Sorry, Nam, you are next. I know you want to talk.
Okay. Sorry to jump in first. That's really interesting. It's nice to have the logic unpacked a bit more, but I can't help but think of a whole lot of holes in the logic or unaddressed issues. I can ask sort of more about those in a minute. What did these theorists say about domestic producers who might have had to source inputs for production of these industries from overseas?
Well, they'd be treated as consumers in this case, yes.
Yeah, and I can't help thinking about that there's no discussion about efficiency, like dead weight losses and alternative ways to kickstart domestic industries.
Well, they do discuss that. They don't, like I'm isolating their theory of tax incidence.
Yeah.
I mean, like these economists, like Buren Denslow, his book is about 800 pages long.
Okay.
Ellis H. Roberts, I think, is about 500 pages, and I think Hoyt's is around about 300 pages or so. Right, so I'm just taking out the relevant analysis when it comes to tax incidence. So I'm not really looking at the efficiency arguments. They certainly do have efficiency arguments there. And I mean, what they argue in terms of efficiency, they're not so much talking about like price efficiency in the neoclassical sense. They had a term which they had coined, which was inventive growth, which they contrasted with accumulative growth. And what they're arguing is that if you have a tariff, this actually gives breathing room for entrepreneurs to actually experiment and discover new modes of production. And they'd argue that in the long run, that's actually how you achieve sustained growth. So.
Very interesting. I did have another question, but I'll let Nan go.
And if you want to know their arguments about efficiency,
okay,
yeah,
I'm sold.
you can order it there.
So now you have your time, and then check it.
Hello.
Hello now.
Hello.
We hear you well.
Hi. Thank you, Mathew. It was a great
Thank you, Nan.
presentation. Yeah. So, I'm just wondering, did you know the book's name, Kick Away the Ladder?
Yeah, by Adrian Chang.
Yeah. That book is very interesting. That it explains why some American applied a protection policy in 18th century and 19th century, but in 20th century when they get rich, so they kick away the ladder. They say no, you don't apply protection, and so we had to do the WTO, we had to lift all the tariff and everything. And now when they get disadvantage, they try to set up again, right? So it looks like to me they only do the protectionist when they feel something disadvantage, when they feel the competition very hard. At the beginning, in 18th century, 19th century, when the Europe offer a lot of good things and they try to catching up. But after they get rich, after the Americans get rich because of many reasons, right? One of my main thing is they have a huge land and lots of other resources, and they can climb up. So then, and they dominated the production, most of the production into the 20th century, and they create WTO, and now we see the violation. So my question is, so protectionist is only good when you are at the same level, right? With other, or you little bit disadvantage, but when you already ahead in technology, in then you don't want this, right? Is that correct? And then because then you want that, okay, all the tariff this, and then I'm from Vietnam, I realize it's very well this. So when we get into the WTO, we're very disadvantaged because like a poor country like Vietnam will never, if we have no tariff, if we play in the free trade world, then we have no hope to catching up with all the high tech products. We have no hope to produce car anyway. If we play in the world no free tax and free trade world. So then now I think now it's come back to the same place that because the US feel behind with the BYD with all the things and they want to set up a tariff so all American cannot buy that very cheap and then they try to build back again, right, to catch up. Is that the idea? You agree with that idea or not?
Okay, I'll get to that. I might just point out that the term kicking the way the ladder actually comes from Friedrich List, who's actually mentioned on this the book cover. Now, when the United States switched from protectionism to free trade, what you've got to keep in mind is that it wasn't these economists that then changed their mind and be like, oh, we're at the top, we should just adopt free trade. What you broadly had in the United States was the Republican Party was the party of protectionism. Just to give you an idea, most of these economists from here onwards, from there were all members of the Republican Party. As I mentioned, Ellis H. Roberts was William McKinley's treasurer. Right. So the shift to free trade wasn't because these economists were like, oh, we're at the top, we're going to switch to free trade now and kick away the ladder. What happened is the Democratic Party was the party of free trade, and they ended up gaining Congress. And it was actually with FDR that America started moving away from protectionism. He signed the Reciprocal Trade Acts, which lowered tariffs, right? So you can't sort of say that these economists were being deceptive and was kicking the way the ladder, because it wasn't these economists that were advising the government at the time, right? Now, there is a little bit of differences between, should a tariff be simply for infant industries or should it be a permanent tariff? What you tended to find is Hamilton was a proponent of infant industry protection, and even Friedrich List actually. What you found from Carey, this is Henry Carey, onwards, is that they were proponents of a permanent tariff. And the reason why they argued is for a permanent tariff, it was really to encourage economic diversification and maintain economic diversification. If you were here for my last talk, I emphasised the diversity of talents argument, where different individuals have different talents, so therefore you want a diversity of industries to accommodate different talents. That was really their argument for permanent protection to maintain that economic diversification. And this actually goes back to Susie's argument about efficiency. What you get with the classical theory is it treats individual labourers as uniform factors of production, right? So in that case, if you had specialisation, then okay, everyone's a uniform factor of production, they can just go into whatever industry the theory of comparative advantage dictates. But if you assume that each individual has different talents, aptitudes, dispositions, it doesn't make sense to specialise in a particular industry. It actually makes sense to have a diversified economy, so you can go into the industry where you're going to be most productive in, and that's actually what's going to maximise economic welfare and economic efficiency.
I know that Shahid has a question, and then Susie again. You have a second question.
Well,
Susie.
it's a very good one.
Thank you. Thanks, Mathew, for this excellent presentation. So I think, obviously the protectionist view was kind of viewpoint at some point of time, and then neoclassical and free trade argument that came forward, and now this policy, protection policies, like I think the dominant view is that is largely applicable for might be developing country context. How effective is this policy for US current time? For example, Trump is now imposing a lot of the tariff, and then one day and the next week cancelling.
Yeah, well,
I
not,
mean, how effective is that because the USA for long, they have been kind of, dominant view is the free trade. And then, like obviously they're starting from Adam Smith, but later on, Nobel laureate like Paul Krugman and Stiglitz, they all advocated free trade, and they have provided analysis in support of their theory that free trade is good. Obviously, we know all of this elasticity and other thing, obviously that impact the consumer. But how impactful is that policy in the contemporary, like present time in USA?
well, I mean, in the case of Krugman, I don't think his new trade theory actually proves that free trade is good. He actually argues that new trade theory, it could be either used to justify free trade conclusions or protectionist conclusions, depending on the individual circumstances. But he then argues that he thinks that free trade is a good thing for political reasons. That seems to be Krugman's argument as far as I'm aware. Now, these economists would, now, I'm not saying that they support the motivations behind what Trump's doing, but they'd argue that, at least from Kerry onwards, that protection is actually applicable for both developed and developing nations. And to do with like the ascendancy of neoclassical economics, I mean, this was kind of an ongoing debate throughout the 19th century. It's not as if neoclassical economics came around and that's where free trade economics come from. First you had Adam Smith in 1776 with the theory of absolute advantage, but it was in 1817 with Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. That's where the key argument for free trade, the theory of comparative advantage, came from. Now, that is still the theory that's invoked by many economists today in favor of free trade. If you buy my book, you can go to the chapter on international trade. I detail how the American protectionists actually contended with the theory of comparative advantage. So, yeah, so you can discover more in the book. So.
Now I feel like buying your book.
Is there anything like permanent tariff? Permanent tariff, is there anything like that in reality?
A what?
Permanent tariff.
Sorry, the
Permanent tariff.
Yeah, that's what they're arguing for from Carey. So Henry Carey, he was the leader of the school. He doesn't really talk about tariff incidence all that much. Like it didn't seem to be much of a concern for him. So he's that one next to Friedrich List up on the book. He was kind of the one that really, there were earlier ones that were arguing in favor of permanent protection, but I guess it was him that you had the real big push for a perpetual tariff. So some of the early ones more infant industry, but then it evolved more into permanent protection. So
This is so interesting. I'm going to advocate for a reading group chat. We can just deal with your chapters.
Oh, thank you.
I'll read a chapter and have a chat. Just following on from Shahid's mention about analysis. Was there analysis done by these economists when they were proposing or putting forward their theories? And I mean, were they looking at the data and finding and analysing the impacts of their tariff? Is there any of that?
Well, yeah, these were more inductive than the classicals. The classicals were actually the ones that tended to, one of the criticisms of David Ricardo is it was all kind of a priori reasoning, and it's commonly been called the Ricardian bias, where he kind of has these sets of assumptions and he makes logical deductions, and that's kind of how we got to the theory of free trade as well, where it was actually these guys were more engaged in historical analysis and inductive analysis. So if you actually read their works, they have, now of course you could make the case that, maybe there's a bit of bias in terms of what statistics they're using, right? But when you actually look at their works, they have various statistical analysis clustered throughout their works. And in fact, if you, I mentioned in the talk that Hamilton wrote the report on manufacturers. It's technically not true. I mentioned that I had that article accepted where I about the conception of the individual, where it differed from Smith. And in that article, what I actually show is that Tench Cox, who's this economist here, he actually played a much more major role in it. So he was actually one of the co-authors of the report on manufacturers. If you actually look at the bulk of his writing, it's very difficult to read because it's almost all just bombarded with statistics and all these historical descriptions of things, and you need to really dig through to actually unearth the theory that's kind of scattered throughout the work. So he was very empirical, and in fact the case for permanent protection was actually, if you really want to trace it back, it was arguably Tench Cox that had that case, because he was the one that came up with that diversity of talents argument, where we should have economic diversification to accommodate different talents. So
Okay, very interesting.
I have a question now, Mathew. Oh, can I ask my question? Because
I'll have to go.
yeah, I've been thinking about
Thank you
this
very much.
for a little bit. So, empirically today, can we see that these theories are applicable? I mean, we can develop several theories, but maybe a bit disconnected with what we have seen. So I asked you this because I heard that there was a study, I think in New York, and they were discussing about what is the percentage of the tariff that will be absorbed by consumers and what could be absorbed by the other countries, that the exporters, and they found that it was around 90% for consumers, so it's still matching what we expected. And basically they tried to explain, discussing that this previous theory, that there could be certain discounts at the beginning, but they were not really sure that these discounts will continue, because if you are an exporter in another country, why you cannot try to find another potential market for your product? So that's the argument that has been floating around. So can you connect this theory, that is valuable theory, with what we could see now in reality?
Well, I'm assuming that the analysis was done on Trump's Liberation Day tariffs. Would that be correct? The analysis conducted in that paper, was it on Trump's Liberation Day tariffs?
Yeah, exactly. So
Yes. Well, in that instance, because it's so recent, you'd kind of expect domestic consumers to be paying, because a lot of that production hasn't been relocated to the United States. So it seems consistent with the theory. In order to actually see whether the theory holds up, you'd actually have to track the incidence over time to see whether it changes, like, because it's a, it's a time-based theory, which depends on the level of industrial development. Evidently, you're going to have foreign producers, if you're imposing the tariff, it's because you're trying to restrict foreign supply. So it's going to take time for actually that production to ramp up in the United States. So that 90% figure doesn't really seem all that surprising when trying to look at it through the lens of what these economists were arguing. It would be whether that doesn't change over time as production increases in the United States.
So you would say that in this case, we expect that in those who are purely for revenue or political cases, in this case, there will be no reduction in the payment from consumers over time, while in the case that is protectionist, then there could be some reduction over time.
But Trump's Liberation Day tariffs, now sometimes it's justified for revenue, sometimes it's justified as a negotiating chip, sometimes it's justified for protection. So, but the motivation as such doesn't really matter, the motivation from Trump's perspective when looking at the tariff. I would think that those Liberation Day tariffs, now it varies between nations, right? The ones that were, say, levied on China, I think any reasonable analyst would conclude that they are protective tariffs just due to how high they are. The ones on like Australia where it's a 10% tariff or something like that, it's a revenue tariff, it's not really going to stimulate.
Well, but in that case, you mean that depending on the level of the tariff will be protective or for revenue? Because I thought that it will be more depending on the specific sector. So, for example, even though you put like 10%, but to coffee, and USA will never produce coffee or avocado, it's still for revenue purposes. While if it's auto industry, maybe that could be protection. You know, to the
I was talking in general. You know, if it is a tariff on coffee, then yeah, it's just going to always be borne by the consumer, I would have to think, unless there's some elasticity kind of reason, although I'd have to think the demand for coffee is relatively inelastic. People are going to keep buying the coffee, or maybe switching to cheaper coffee or something. But you know, some of those high rates when it comes to you know, heavy tariffs on you know, Chinese vehicles and those sorts of things, I'd have to think that that's a protective tariff in nature. So I was speaking kind of in a generalization that the rates themselves are rates that would be considered protective, but then when you go down to the industry level, then it might be protective for some industries, some it might just be a tariff on a non-competing import because the US isn't going to produce those goods. So, but for those ones where it is protective, whether this theory bears out, you'd have to wait and see over time, you know, if the incidence actually changes.
Because I would expect that why a producer in other country will sell for a lower price to the Americans, unless they have that contract settled and they need to sell their products. But in the meantime, they could be looking for alternative markets, and then over time, that's the logic that they follow, that over time that discount that they're doing at the moment could be decreasing because, oh, I found another good deal with the Europeans, so I will sell less to the Americans, and then you pay the same, I sell you at the same price that I sell to everyone, and then it's up to you if you want to put tariff or not. That's what is the argument, that they expect that over time it should increase the level of the payment on tariff, because the discount that we saw, that 10%, will be decreasing.
I mean, the United States is such a large market, I couldn't see them actually withdrawing from the US market, even with the tariffs, you know.
No, it won't be withdrawing, it will be more like reducing, because we know that they will export less, so Americans will import less, and then they could say, okay, I could try to redirect that amount that they will import less to other markets, let's say in Europe or
yeah, but what these guys are arguing, okay, they could, but they could restrict it up the price, but they're going to be even losing even more sales in the US once you have domestic competition come up. So that's the mechanism where they're forced, well, I'm going to lose sales unless I absorb some of these tariffs because there's all these domestic producers. Like, I kind of think, I don't know, I don't really find the argument put forth in that paper to be particularly convincing. I can't see that these exporters are just going to abandon the American market. You know, it's such a large market.
That's what I think Australia did when China imposed restrictions on some of the Australian products. When Australia found some alternatives.
Someone else, yeah, but we were not
to export.
Yeah, well, a lot of those things were embargoes where we had to leave the Chinese market because we physically couldn't export into that market. Where
they were super high. Yeah.
Well, I don't think they were even high tariffs in many of the cases. I think some of them were just straight out of bans, so you couldn't export when, you know, that's a very different situation to a tariff where you're copying the tax, but you're not excluded from the market.
Super.
No, that's all right. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. Thank you, Matthew. Very interesting presentation. I have two questions. I just wanted to understand what were the economic, social, and political conditions under which these, theoretical advances were proposed or made relative to the economic, political, and social conditions in elsewhere. I'm not sure how strong US was in terms of politically or socially or even economically at that time compared to the rest of the world, particularly Britain and so on.
Yeah.
The other thing, that question that I have is about theory building. How has it changed? I mean, during those times and subsequently, of course now we have a lot of empirical analysis, more sophisticated analysis that is now undertaken because there is a lot of information that is being captured as well.
Yeah.
But generally in terms of the theoretical building, how context is considered in that theory building, in terms of abstracting what kind of things they have abstracted, in terms of building those theories,
Well, in terms of the context, it is different between the different generations here. So Hamilton was writing when, I should point out that with the report on the impost, it was purely for a revenue tariff because that's what was being debated at the time. In the Continentalist, he was actually arguing for a protective tariff. But, now that was when America was essentially an agricultural nation. They didn't have manufacturing, and that was the case for industry protection. When you got to the 1880s, I believe that the US was already a larger economy than Britain at that time. So they had become kind of an industrial powerhouse at that point in time. So what you actually tend to find more is in those writings of Denslow, Roberts, and Hoyt, is they seem to be emphasizing that maintaining these tariffs because we're already so developed it's not really a cost to consumers because we're at such a point in time that if these foreign producers want to enter our market, they're going to have to absorb the tariffs. So what they're actually emphasizing there kind of does shift because by the 1880s, America was so developed. Now, that's not to say there weren't infant industries still around. Some of them might have been infant industries, so it's going to be more sector specific as well. So, these guys did have basic statistical analysis of just looking at quantitative figures, but like econometrics wasn't a thing at the time. So they're operating with the tools that they had. I don't think it wasn't until after World War II that econometrics emerged as a discipline. So it was kind of a foreign concept to what they were doing. So.
In terms of theory building, you see in theoretical work usually a lot of proofs, based on logical arguments or using some form of mathematics, those kind of things.
Yeah, it's very, they're not using mathematics in terms of using it to construct a theory, right? They're using quantitative analysis to give empirical backing to the theories, but the actual theories themselves are very much qualitative. There's no, when you go into their works, there's no formulas or mathematics in there. With that said, they were into system building. Like, I don't have a list of chapters from there, but like I go through them and I list their, their theoretical foundations, their theory of price, their theory of distribution, their theory of production, international trade. So it was very systematic how they approached how they approached the subject, and it was a system of interconnecting laws, but they didn't attempt to mathematize their theory. And from my understanding, Henry, when mathematics was first introduced into economics, it was with, there might have been earlier versions, but when it came in more sort of force was the marginalist revolution in the 1870s. I believe Alfred Marshall, the founder of neoclassical economics, he had visited the United States, and apparently he interviewed Henry Carey, and apparently Carey was just complaining about Jevons's book being just a bunch of mathematical mumbo jumbo, and he's just kind of saying this, why is all of this needless mathematics included here? So I got a sense that they probably wouldn't have been too fond of it, and even when marginalism had come in, they didn't incorporate mathematics into their work. So
I think my observation is that because all of this theory that focused on this period of time, like particularly in the United States, that's the early stage of their economic development, and particularly when they try to protect agriculture and other businesses, and then that is always the case for developing countries. Basically, they try to protect certain industries in the early stage of economic development. The question is basically once again how it is effective being practiced in this contemporary, competitive, and more mature, the American economy.
Yeah, but
It's just
Yeah, and also you need to consider how big is US respect to the rest of the world. Because maybe at that time it represented a very important market, even in the 1990s, but now it's like 10% of the world trade. So that could impact the effectiveness of these theories too.
But I mean, like the United States was a, developed and developing, it's always a relative term. I mean, it was underdeveloped relative to now, but the United States at the time was developed relative to, many other nations. The only ones that were really rivaling them was Germany, England. Germany was also protectionist at this time. Friedrich List was German, and he took a lot of those protectionist ideas back to Germany. So I think saying that, this was during their stages of development, but every nation is developing, but relative to other nations at the time, the United States would be considered one of the most developed economies, so they are writing it with respect to, at least these later writers, the likes of Hamilton and Raymond, they're approaching it from the standpoint of a developing nation, but these later writers are approaching it from the standpoint of a developed nation. So, that's...
Okay, thank you for your presentation. My query is about continuation of the previous speakers' questions, the practicality of tariff nowadays. Okay, when we are the signatories of WTO, World Trade, and promoter of free trade. So US also, I think, signatory of that. And I also stress that it's not only US who is using tariff as a weapon. Some other countries also use it, like China did it. I think India as well, in some extent, to some countries.
South Korea.
Yeah, South Korea. So it's not because
not only
US only. Yeah, but in terms of today's world environment, business environment, the practicality of tariff, how justified it is.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I'm emphasising the United States is this kind of was a distinct school of thought from the United States, so that's why I'm emphasising it. But a lot of these later economies borrowed the ideas from these economists. So Friedrich List, he took the ideas to Germany. Echelon Smith, he was an ambassador, I believe, to Japan, and he took these protectionist ideas to Japan and was publishing articles in the Tokyo Times. And it seems like there was actually some connection where these protectionist ideas from the United States actually spread around the world through different channels. But in terms of the whether it's applicable to the modern era, I mean, when you go back and read the primary sources back in back in these times, it does kind of seem like the same arguments in terms of practicality keep reoccurring. I mean, was the United States more dependent on foreign supplies back in the 1770s versus 1890s in the reporter menu? Were they more dependent then versus now? I would have to think that they would be more dependent then on European manufactured goods than what they are now. So the idea that it's more difficult to restructure supply lines now versus then, I'm kind of speculating on this. I haven't exactly looked into it in detail. I'm just kind of thinking that a lot of these debates seem to reoccur, and at the time, the issue of practicality was also, I mean, the difference is we have those multilateral institutions like the WTO and those sorts of things, but I mean, at the moment, the WTO isn't really even functioning at the moment, so, you know, it's, and I mean, yeah, it isn't only Trump that's imposing tariffs. I mean,
for sure.
many developed economies are, and even ones you don't really think about, like the European Union still has hefty tariffs, not so much on manufactured goods, but on agricultural products still have hefty tariffs. So we kind of think that it is just, oh, well, it's just Trump that's imposing these, but it's actually a lot of, it was just, he's a lot more overt about it and makes all announcements, where the other ones are a bit more covert and a bit more strategic, I guess. And
Because what you were discussing was more like the infant industry theory that went to Japan and in Germany to develop the auto industry, but not something across the board like Trump is doing in a non-strategic way, more like a weapon way.
Well, what they're saying, what this argument is kind of implying here is that you use the tariffs to develop the infant industries, but when they have developed, if it's the foreign producer that's paying the incidence, why should we bother removing the tariffs? Because we're essentially collecting that revenue and it's not our consumers paying for it. So that's kind of the reason why that kind of infant industry protection ends up evolving into permanent. Now, it's not the only argument. They're just making the justification that, well, if it's in place and now they're developed, now it's the foreign producer that's absorbing the tariff, well, why should we bother removing it? That's kind of what they're...
But maybe there is a cost benefit, because I understand that the other countries will say, okay, you can export your cars here now that you develop, but you have to reduce the tariff for my car, so that's the free
Well, yeah,
trade.
they're analysing in isolation. They're not assuming that there's retaliation involved. They're just analysing it. If this happens, this is what we'd expect to occur. So it is kind of viewing it in isolation, because it's kind of a general theory, I guess, where, yes.
Some people blame Elon Musk. He's
Well,
pushing Trump.
Anyway, anyone has the last question? Because I am very hungry. We need to eat the sandwich.
Yes, last questions. Last questions. Yes.
Caroline, do you want your last question?
Last questions. Thank you, Matthew. That's really interesting. I don't talk about the tourists. I just would like to ask you, and have you applied these theories into the empirical research by yourself?
No, I haven't.
Not yet?
Well, I mean, what I primarily am, I'm not sure how I shot this, but
Just close that.
I'll just leave it there. I mean, I'm not a like econometrician or like a quantitative analyst, right? I'm a historian of economic thought, basically, and a political economist, sort of cross the line between the two. I guess what I'm more interested in is kind of rediscovering these like economic ideas that have been overlooked. Now, if someone else wants to then take these ideas and actually assess whether they hold up using some sort of empirical analysis, then that's it's great if they do that, but I guess my specialization is more on intellectual history. That's where I'm coming from.
I know a good econometrician, so probably he will be accepted. Do you think so, Nam?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone.
thank you.
It was a lively debate, and I think this has kind of helped me with preempting questions that might be asked at the PES conference. So thanks very much.